Okay, good morning for everyone. For those of you who may not already know me, my name is Casey and I will be talking about my externship experience in South Carolina with animal advocacy and animal sheltering. I did my summer externship at Pawmetto Lifeline, which is a non-for-profit animal rescue organization in Columbia, South Carolina. Their mission is to end pet homelessness in the Midlands of South Carolina, which is this red area over here. They work primarily in Richland and Lexington County, and so that's predominantly where I focused this summer. Pawmetto Lifeline used to be known as Project Pet, and in 2012 they opened up their new facility, which is where I worked. So this is the front entrance here, and off to the side will be the entrance to the clinic, and they have a really nice upstairs multi-purpose indoor dog play area, and it's actually usually not this empty. You'll see some pictures later full of a bunch of kittens in their cages. Their facility includes a spay and neuter clinic, which on some days is used for vaccine services or wellness visits. They have 2 dog wards, one for adoptions, this is shown right here, and another one for daycare and boarding. They got some really nice cat condos, and over here is just the outdoor area so the cats can come out of the condos and roam around. They have cat colony rooms, so here's some sleeping cats right here. There's a meet and greet room for cats, and there's also 4 for dogs. And then these are a bunch of the office kitties that were hanging around and stuff. And then just not shown, they have some outdoor play areas, isolation rooms for the animals that might be sick, intake kennels, a nursery for nursing puppies and kittens, and education rooms. So the CEO of Pawmetto Lifeline in this gray dress over here was my externship mentor. I met her working at Pawmetto Lifeline actually the summer before. I was just working part-time on Fridays and Saturdays in animal care. And I volunteered with her on some policy stuff for a little bit that summer, and so that's how I got to know her. And this is Raymond, who was one of her office cats this summer, who got adopted this summer. All right, so due to COVID, I spent 6 weeks of my externship working completely remote from my parents' lake house, and the other 4 weeks I got to go in person. The 3 main focuses of my externship were puppy mills in South Carolina, addressing a nuisance cat ordinance in Lexington County, and conducting a survey of all the shelters in South Carolina on how they responded to or were affected by the pandemic. In person, I got to experience the spay and neuter clinic. I got to go to municipal shelters to observe intake, and I volunteered for a weekend kitten adoption event. So I would say the biggest chunk of the things that I worked on this summer was the puppy mill stuff, since it just happened to be something I could easily manage working on from home. And even when I did eventually go in person, I still was working on this stuff. And actually a lot of the stuff that I worked on during the externship overlapped, and so I'd be addressing multiple things at the same time. So for the externship, I focused on the state and local level. But there was still more that I researched and learned about the issue just overall in the US. So starting out early on in the externship, I reached out to one of Denise's contacts, who is Kelsey Gilmore-Futerall, who is the South Carolina State Director for the Humane Society of the United States, just as a starting point to see what we could do about addressing puppy mills. And so the 3 of us met over Zoom just to see what Denise and I could do in our area. And so the 2 general approaches for fighting puppy mills are 1, to regulate the dog breeders themselves, and then 2, to cut off the pet store supply chain of puppies. And so Kelsey and her team had hosted a Stop Puppy Mills workshop in Charleston in December, and so that's one of the more coastal areas of South Carolina. And so she was interested in doing another, but in order to have that, they would need some sort of call to action for the attendees. And so for that workshop that she had in December, their action was a proposed humane pet store ordinance in Dorchester County, which is near Charleston. And that ordinance actually passed this June. And so in our area in South Carolina, in Richland and Lexington County, there were already local laws to regulate dog breeders. And so needing some sort of legislation to accompany a puppy mill workshop, if we were to hold one, I decided to kind of initiate the process, and I wanted to write a letter to local council members in the area to ask them to introduce a pet store, humane pet store ordinance. And so I wrote that letter, I sent it to Kelsey for some edits, and then she sent it to the Humane Society's puppy mill campaign, and then they returned like a whole new letter to me. It was pretty great. I think maybe like a paragraph or two was about the same, but that's what I used, and I reached out to 4 local council members with that letter, and I got one response. And that was from Councilman Bill Malinowski, who is actually the representative of my parents' district in Richland County. And he seemed interested in the ordinance, but he wanted more information. So with the help of Kelsey and Meredith Blanchard, who's actually a MAPP alum, they provided me with some of the resources, like some fact sheets to send to him, and I added some supplemental information from the CDC. And then as of right now, just the attempt with that, trying to get that ordinance introduced kind of fizzled because Malinowski had reached out to the animal care, the Richland County Animal Care Director, and according to my externship mentor, just her experience with this person, that she's not really the best advocate for animals, and so she was supposed to give feedback to Malinowski, and I think she did, but I tried to reach out to her and see what was going on, and she didn't really tell me anything, and so that's just how that was left. But also, I mean, with the pandemic going on, so maybe that wasn't one of his focuses at the moment. At the same time, I used a Freedom of Information Act, a FOIA request, to get a list of breeders in each county, and I also got their inspection reports, and so that was really interesting to see. And so that FOIA request gave Denise and Roy Mefford, who is the director of Lexington County Animal Services, an idea for Pawmetto Lifeline to partner with some of the breeders to improve the standards of care for their breeding dogs, and then for those puppies to be featured at Pawmetto Lifeline. And Denise is still working on that pilot that partnership with like one of the breeders. But the idea is like a little out there, and it definitely made me a little nervous at first. I know other people are definitely nervous about it because it kind of seems contrary to the mission of ending pet homelessness. But, you know, we're not against, you know, responsible pet breeders. And if people aren't going to adopt, we want them to go to these good breeders that are willing to work with us. And so I contributed to that by writing a letter to help initiate the process. And when I left, I don't know if it has been used yet. They're probably still working on it. And so the attempted Humane Pet Store Ordinance and the Breeder Partnership Program were the focus of my legislative case study for my final paper for my externship. And then last, I had just learned so much about puppy mills that summer that I just wanted to share what I knew. And so I worked with the head of IT at Pawmetto Lifeline to have a platform to disseminate some of that information. And so we worked on a resource web page, but I think Heather is still finalizing that and to get it published. All right, so along with working on the puppy mill stuff in Lexington County, there was a nuisance cat ordinance that had been introduced in the county council, and that had been a huge red flag that trap, neuter, return, so TNR, of feral cats might be gotten rid of. And so Denise and her team launched a campaign against this ordinance right as I was starting my externship, and they asked the public to email and call Lexington County Council to tell them not to kill cats. And I also wrote a letter, and in my letter I was a bit more informative. I talked about how the definition of nuisance cat in their ordinance was problematic, how TNR was important, and how it works to stabilize and reduce feral cat populations, and how other methods there's other methods to deter nuisance cats instead of just impounding them. And so I sent that to all of the council members, and I got one response saying thank you. And so all those emails and calls, they worked because Denise got a meeting with the council members who they actually had no intention of getting rid of TNR. It was just a huge miscommunication. The council was a little mad about all that stuff that they got, but I mean, it worked in the end. And so Pawmetto Lifeline, Denise worked with them to revise the ordinance in its standard operating procedure. They also held a public hearing on the nuisance cat ordinance, which Denise asked me to speak at. So using what I learned from communicating policy positions, I prepared and delivered my 2-minute testimony in person in a completely pandemic-safe experience. I was actually one of the only speakers who wore a mask, like while I was speaking at the podium. They actually disinfected it in between each speaker. And so the proof is there on the live stream, which is where I got this picture of me. And before the hearing closed, one of the council members, she asked for a copy of my testimony. And so I had an extra written testimony that I had brought that had an extra paragraph beyond what I had spoken. And so that just wrapped up. The nuisance cat ordinance was later revised and finalized into county code and language that was more acceptable to Pawmetto Lifeline. And Pawmetto will actually be involved in carrying out the procedures when there are complaints about people and cats being nuisances. And so next, the last focus of my externship was a survey of all the shelters in South Carolina on how they responded to the pandemic by changing their protocols, what trends they had in adoptions, intake, etc. And I collected some numbers to see what the trends were. No Kill South Carolina, which is an initiative of Charleston Animal Society that actually collects data on the outcomes of animals from shelters across the state each year, they helped me disseminate that survey to 77 shelters. However, I ended up not really getting good results on that because I had been working on the puppy mill stuff so much that I put off the survey a little bit, and so it was sent out kind of late, mid to late July, near the end of my externship, and so I got about 20% response rate. I will admit the survey was a bit long, and just with shelter staff being busy with kitten season and the pandemic, it's kind of understandable. And even some of the shelters, when I was talking to the ladies from No Kill South Carolina, they said that I would have had to FOIA request them to get them to even respond at all. And with COVID, there would have been like a delayed response of up to a month with that. I think the results overall were just very shelter dependent, and I only had a small fraction to really tell what any trend was, and every organization is different, and I think they all responded differently. A couple surprising things were that 6 of the shelters had staff that were exposed, symptomatic, or tested positive for COVID, but that was only out of 16 shelters. And so out of all 77, there were probably more that had that happen. And one of those shelters actually even laid off 3 to 4 of their staff members. And then, so for my in-person experience, I got to do surgery prep in the spay and neuter clinic. Right here, if you see my mouse, that's the station that I worked at mostly. This door right here goes to the kitten room and the dog room. And so what happens is we would do dogs in the morning, and if there was time before lunch, we would start some of the cats. And after lunch, we would do cats from the public, and then we would do feral cats. And these are some of the feral cat traps, which is in a separate room. And then the next experience I had in person, which was very enlightening, was I got to go with the intake coordinator, Megan, to two different municipal shelters. We first went to Lexington County Animal Services, and we were there to pick up one dog, and we were shown around by one of the animal care officers to dogs that she thought Megan might be interested in taking. And so Megan would either commit to that dog, and on Monday she came back for those dogs that she committed to, and the other dog she was like, maybe I'll think about it. And so what we were doing there is just because with kitten season, space was very limited at Pawmetto Lifeline, and so Megan could only pull highly adoptable dogs, and that's what she was looking for when looking at the dogs. And so we would only pick dogs with unique characteristics that would make people want to adopt them. And the next week, we were on our way to the City of Columbia shelter, and Megan told me that some of those dogs from Lexington County that were the maybes were actually on a list to be euthanized for space, and Megan was trying to figure out what to do. I don't know actually what happened there, but you know, this was a case where there was just multiple dogs per run, and they unfortunately had to euthanize for space. So at the City of Columbia, so where there were more dogs at Lexington, at the City of Columbia, there were way more cats, and honestly, some of those cats were probably going to get euthanized because they don't have a full-time veterinarian on staff, and they can't put them up for adoption until they're spayed or neutered. And so while we were there, we looked around at some dogs, and we ended up deciding on 3 pit bulls to take, and then 1 small white dog. And all of those dogs actually got adopted in about a week after we took them. And so we really were just looking at dogs that wouldn't sit in the shelter long, and at least we got to save those lives. And to end my experience on a more positive note, the last fun thing I got to do at my externship was help kittens get adopted during the Kitten Palooza adoption event. And so this is me playing with some kittens over here. And so when it was slow, I would just take out a litter of kittens and play with them in a pen. And it was just really rewarding because I got to help a bunch of adopters decide on kittens to take home. The first couple that I helped, they came for 1 kitten and then ended up leaving with 3. And there were some adopters, I convinced them to take home like a hard sell kitten, which is one that wasn't spayed or neutered yet. And so people were kind of discouraged because with those ones that weren't fixed yet, they couldn't take them home that day. They had to wait until they got spayed or neuter later next week. But I got some adopters to commit to some of those kittens. And overall, it was just hard for me to not bring one home myself because it was a good deal. It was $50 to adopt a kitten. That's normally $150. And to wrap up, I'd just like to say thank you to my mentors, Denise and Dr. McCobb, and then those that helped me during my externship, especially Kelsey for helping me with the puppy mill stuff, and Becca and Abigail from No Kill, South Carolina, who helped me distribute my survey, Dr. Rutberg for teaching me how to testify effectively, and then just all of the faculty and staff of the MAPP program for teaching me this year. I've learned and experienced so much from being in this program that'll be useful in my future career. And speaking of my career, what's next for me is to finish vet school, and I just started that 3 weeks ago here at the University of Illinois, and I have a test coming up in about a week, and I want to focus on community medicine, which is focusing on pet retention so that pets don't end up in shelters. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, we have a few minutes.
We do have a question from Grace. Good job, Casey. Grace, do you want to say your question? You want me to read it for you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I was just wondering about like the intake model. So did the shelter you're at only accept owner or transfers, or were they owner surrenders?
So I think both. It was kind of dependent from what I talked to with Megan. She would have like email exchanges with people and she would try to fix the problem first, but even then it was still very limited and stuff. But yeah, did that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Are there any other questions?
David said, great presentation. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I see Denise is with us. Thank you for joining for Casey's talk.
Oh, and Lindsay from Massachusetts Animal Coalition said, very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Casey. You got a heck of a lot done, and thank you for the shout out for the communicating policy positions course. I'm glad it was helpful. Okay, our next speaker is Shannon Jaguar. We'll be talking about Rain in a Dream, operations and certification of a PATH International Premier Accredited Center during COVID-19.